Welcome to an exclusive episode of Mad Men Sports. Today we have an exclusive interview with Matthew Coller, host of the Purple Daily. Today's episode is presented by Black Button Distilling. Cheers to a day well done. Enjoy the interview. So let's start off with Kirk Cousins. You guys are going into the second year with Kirk Cousins. How's that contract working out for Minnesota this year? What do you think?
Well, I think that year one is obviously a disappointment for Kirk Cousins and for the Vikings. When they decided to pay out $84 million, the plan was to get equal or better quarterback play than they had received in 2017 from Case Keenum, because Kirk Cousins is a more talented quarterback than Case Keenum, but they did not get what they paid for. When you pull up the fantasy stats, if you drafted him and he was your quarterback, then you felt okay about 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns. But when you take a microscope to that season, there were a lot of situations where the Vikings just simply needed better quarterback play than they got, and most namely is Week 17, where they went up against the Chicago Bears. And the Bears were already in the playoffs. They could have beaten some Bears backups, especially in the second half, and gotten into the playoffs. They were playing at U.S. Bank Stadium in Minnesota, so everything was kind of set up for the Vikings to get that win and get in the playoffs. And Kirk Cousins basically no-showed in that game. And even though the Bears have a great defense, it was, I think, just as much on Cousins as it was on the Bears playing really well on their side, too. And that's just one example of where he didn't come through, but there were a number of times where, he put up a lot of those yards getting down by a couple of scores and then trying to bring them back unsuccessfully. And, I think as far as the contract goes, though, it's still to be determined. After year one, sure, it wasn't worth it. And in year two, they couldn't spend in free agency like they would have wanted to fill out some key positions, especially on the offensive line. But, if Kirk Cousins performs better with a new offensive coordinator in year two and gets them to the playoffs and they're competitive and have a chance to be right there at the end, then we're going to look back at this contract and say, well, at least one out of the 2 years worked out pretty well. So I think this is going to be a big swing year for how people feel about the contract, because if they miss the playoffs again, it's going to look like a massive, massive mistake and a total bust for the Vikings. But if they're as competitive as they were in 2017, then, I don't think there are going to be too many complaints about how many paychecks he cashed.
Absolutely. Being from Buffalo, I understand the importance of just making the playoffs. So, if you can get a quarterback in the room and in a team that can just get you to the playoffs, it feels like a success no matter what happens. He's carrying a $29 million cap hit. That's got to really weigh on the team, especially if you don't make the playoffs, because you're going into the third and final year. But at the time when he signed it, it was kind of a deal like that's kind of what the running market price for a quarterback of his caliber was in that free agency market. So it was really interesting to see. Now, he does have a lot of weapons with him, with Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. In more of a fantasy perspective, who do you prefer out of the two? I know there's like back and forth, they're almost neck and neck for the type of talent they are. Who do you prefer out of Diggs or Thielen going into the fantasy season?
Yeah, I think if you're a fantasy player, you're talking about Adam Thielen, because he spends a lot more time in the slot. And what we know about slot wide receivers is that they catch a lot of open balls over the middle. A lot of things can be schemed up for them for catch and run type of situations, and they often rack up a lot of receptions where outside wide receivers don't always, but can tend to get more big plays and things like that. And I think Stephon Diggs playing on the outside will make for fewer total receptions. If you're asking me which one is the actual better wide receiver, I think it is Stephon Diggs by a nose. But to your point about the weapons that they have, those two last year, early in the season, were incredibly effective. But as the season wore on, it became clear that defenses knew that beyond Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, the Vikings couldn't do a whole lot to threaten them in the passing game, aside from check down to their tight end Kyle Rudolph. So that's one of the reasons that they drafted Irv Smith, and he's going to be an interesting one because the Vikings did not spend on a number 3 wide receiver. Instead, they brought back Rudolph, and they drafted Irv Smith. So I think that what you're going to see is the Vikings use a lot of two tight ends and try to run the ball a lot with Dalvin Cook and use play action. So you might end up having this team run a lot more, and maybe Kirk Cousins doesn't put up quite as big of numbers this year when it comes to the receptions for Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. But overall, they're hoping for a much more effective offense and more efficient passing game than they had last year.
Yeah, like you said, with Dalvin Cook a little bit, taking the pressure off of Kirk Cousins might help him kind of relax and make the more positive throws rather than towards the end of the season last year when he was kind of making just terrible misses and just really missing on a lot of his important hits. So what do you think about Dalvin Cook? What would you expect out of him? Do you think you get another, a really stunning year like he had his first year, or the injury he's coming off of really bugging him a little bit?
Well, I think that the injury from year one where he tore his ACL in week 4 impacted him in year 2 because it made the training for him in the offseason difficult. And, he came back and looked like he was 100% in terms of his speed came back and everything else after the torn ACL. But it took a little bit of a toll on the rest of his body, and he had a hamstring injury that was, kind of a week-to-week type of thing for most of the middle of the season, and that hampered him quite a bit. And he still, if you look at his numbers, played pretty darn well. I think he averaged 4.6 yards per carry still, and the fact that the Vikings also did not have a very good offensive line at all tells you a lot about Dalvin Cook's talent. I mean, I look at him as someone that if he stays healthy for 14 to 16 games can be one of the best running backs in the NFL. I think he could be somewhere in that range of what Todd Gurley has been for the Rams without the great offensive line that the Rams have had over the last few years, but still someone who can push 5 yards a carry, someone who can catch somewhere in the range of 60 balls or something like that. I mean, if you're drafting at the top of your fantasy league, that's somebody that you want. But even more importantly for the Vikings, I mean, this is a guy, like you said, that has to take pressure off of Kirk Cousins, because it isn't just the fact that he can break off big runs and things like that and make for very easy drives with a 20 or 30-yard carry, but it's also the fact that he's going to be the option out of the backfield for Cousins. And last year, with him in and out of the lineup, the backup Latavius Murray was not a huge threat in the passing game. So that's where I think Dalvin is going to be really, really valuable for Kirk Cousins.
Yeah, fantasy owners are just dying to get some actual consistency out of Dalvin Cook because, like you said, he's just right below 5 yards per carry. He's got some impressive catching stats, but being able to put together a full season of even the 12 to 14 game season, like you said, that would be so big for his maturation process that it would just help his growth, and fantasy owners can finally trust him. Moving away from the fantasy aspect a little bit, now being in the AFC East, we're a Bills podcast. We have the Jets right across, the state over there. So with the Jets, they tried to snag Anthony Barr. Anthony Barr slept on it, backtracked and said, wait, I got to go back to Minnesota. What's the word around town about what happened with Anthony Barr? Can I get an inside scoop on that?
I think Anthony Barr gave us pretty much all the details on what happened. He said that he had agreed to a deal that his agent got the most money he could possibly get, and that was from the New York Jets. And then as he thought about it and talked to some of his teammates and talked to his family and everything else, he just decided that he really did not want to leave the Minnesota Vikings. And, this is a pretty rare situation here with the Vikings defense. If you go back to 2015 and you look at the key players that the Vikings have on defense in 2019, they're almost all the same. And try to find another team that has as many starters on their defense in 2019 as they did in 2015. It doesn't happen very often, that especially during the 2017 season when they went to the NFC Championship game, this defense became very, very close. And they believe that they can lead the Vikings to a championship. They believe that they can be the number one defense in the NFL again like they were in 2017. And the relationships and bonds that these guys have built with each other over the years under Mike Zimmer during his era, and they've been one of the best defenses every year except for Zimmer's first, it's really remarkable. I don't think that I've seen too many defenses like this. You would probably say it for maybe the Ravens years ago and Seattle for a long time with Richard Sherman and Cam Chancellor and Earl Thomas and all those guys. But, it's not something you run across very often where a team has a great defense year in and year out and the players form these close bonds. So I think that was really the reason that Anthony Barr decided to come back to Minnesota as opposed to going to New York.
Yeah, I mean, that night was full of just like a bunch of crazy rumors, and then he finally came out and was just upfront about it. When you say it out loud, it totally makes sense that keeping that defense together had to be really important to him and the players around him that he's played with for many years. Now, you might kind of mention Anthony Barr, and we talk about him a little bit. Do you remember week 4, or was it week 3 last year against the Bills, when Josh Allen kind of jumped over him? Has he struggled like that outside of those games? Or was that just something he hasn't seen before and he wasn't really prepared? Viking defense as a whole.
Yeah, I don't think that anything in week 3 was really representative of that team from last year. Even, the Kirk Cousins meltdown, no-show happened a couple times, but against much better teams than the Bills, although the Bills did have a good defense. But some of the open running backs out of the backfield and open wide receivers and things like that, that carried over to week 4, and then the Vikings made a lot of adjustments, and after that they still ended up as, I believe, the 4th best defense in the NFL in yards against. So there were a lot of changes that happened after week 3 and week 4. And, Josh Allen is an unusual athlete, right? So him doing something like that, especially a player that Anthony Barr had never seen before, I think it was just a guy making a special, freakish athletic play. But the overall on Anthony Barr is that he is one of the most unique athletic specimens himself at the position. Most teams around the league are looking for smaller linebackers. They're looking for guys that are 220 pounds and 200 can cover tight ends, can cover wide receivers if you need, cover running backs out of the backfield. And Anthony Barr can do all of that stuff at 6'5" and 260 pounds. So he is kind of an unusual player, and I think that's one of the reasons the Vikings really wanted him back. But it is funny throughout his career that there has been a general feeling that he hasn't quite lived up to the expectations that he set in his first and second season, in part because of some of the inconsistency. And maybe what you saw there in week 3 was one of his down games. He also had one in week 17 when they least needed it. He had his lowest graded game by Pro Football Focus, and I would agree with that just watching the tape back. So that's one of those things that, as they pay him a lot of money, though he is a unique specimen and a really, really, really talented player, his inconsistency sometimes makes that a little questionable how much money they doled out considering their salary cap issues.
Yeah, I know that Bills fans were kind of chomping at the bit, getting him back, getting him into the division, get to play him twice a year, kind of give him like the Kiko Alonso effect, because Josh Allen has done that to a couple different linebackers throughout the season. So, him staying in Minnesota is going to be a huge save for that defense, because, I've watched him. He had a great first couple years, and then, he's kind of tailed off, and different systems has been a little different for him. So, if I could ask you to rank the NFC North quarterbacks 1 through 4, would you mind doing that for me? I know there's a lot of talk about Trubisky might be an MVP candidate. Rodgers is coming back, strong. He's got, Adams, and he's got Jones now. He's finally might have a running back that might get going. Matt Stafford's still in the division. There's a lot of quarterbacks to go around. What could you mind ranking those from 1 to 4?
So I think that there are 2 different ways to rank them. You can rank them by how talented you think they are, or you can rank them by how talented with factoring in for their situation. And either way, Aaron Rodgers is number 1 because the situation isn't bad enough to pull him down. And I think he's going to have a new offense that's going to fit for him pretty well. And, of course, he's the most talented. But after that, it gets interesting. I think that Matt Stafford is more talented than Kirk Cousins and Mitch Trubisky, but I really don't believe in what he has around him right now. If they get Marvin Jones back healthy, that's going to help them a lot. But still, T.J. Hawkinson's going to be a rookie tight end. I don't know what to expect there, even though I think he's very talented. And then, you hear their offensive coordinator talking about how they want to run the ball a lot and everything else. So I don't know if Matt Stafford is going to have a 5,000-yard season or anything like that when they're talking about running the ball and they draft a tight end, to add to their weapon group. So I would probably put Kirk Cousins second because he has Adam Thielen, Stephon Diggs, and they brought back Kyle Rudolph and have added an offensive system with Gary Kubiak that is going to be more fit for Kirk Cousins than it was last year. So I'd probably put Cousins number 2 if we're factoring in their situation. And then it's hard for me because I really don't believe in the Lions But I also don't think that Mitch Trubisky is a particularly good quarterback. Having watched a lot of him last year from the tape in the games leading up to against the Vikings to get prepared for those games and then against the Vikings, he's not very accurate. He has a lot of trouble stepping and throwing when there's people in his face, especially when there's any type of pressure. And there were so many times where he got into trouble and had to use his legs to get out of it, but was really inaccurate a lot of times. And if you look at the Pro Football Focus grades on just his throws, he was one of the more inaccurate quarterbacks in the entire NFL. And I would agree with that from watching the tape back. So I think I would say that Trubisky's got a good chance because of his offensive weapons. They added Cordero Patterson there, which I think is going to help him a lot. So I would put him 3 when you're contextualizing it with what he has around him and the coach he has. But if we were talking talent, I would have Trubisky at the bottom.
And that makes honestly perfect sense. I can't imagine my rankings would be too far off. There's a lot of talent at quarterback, but then there's a huge disparity from players around him players being around the quarterback being good, and then the quarterback itself. So I liked how you put it in 2 separate groups there. Now, just to wrap up this interview, if you could throw me a Bills record prediction, what do you think that the Bills could be? You think they could be a playoff team this year, just miss completely? What do you got?
Well, to me, it's a hard one to figure out because they did a lot of really smart things, I thought, in the offseason with the free agents that they signed. And, the offensive line is leaps and bounds better than it was last year. In fact, they signed a couple of offensive linemen that I thought the Vikings should have signed, including Quentin Spain. That was kind of an underrated late signing, and he might be a decent player for them. So I think the upgrades on the offensive line are helpful. Getting extra wide receivers is helpful and so forth. But it comes down to the quarterback, right? I mean, if you get the same type of quarterback play as last year, Josh Allen doesn't take a big step forward. And I think it has to be a huge step forward. I know that people there in Buffalo are happy with some of the stuff they saw, but he was dead last in the NFL with clean pocket quarterback rating, which usually tells you a lot about how a quarterback played. And that's got to be disturbing, right? That he was inaccurate a lot of the times and a little bit slow to process, which, you expect some of that as a rookie quarterback. But considering the college stats and things like that, it's going to have to be a pretty darn big step forward for them to be a legitimate contender, I think. The defense has a lot of talent, but I never bet on defenses year to year. So, right now I think they're probably an 8-8 team, but with the potential to be 5-11 or 6-10 if Josh Allen doesn't play a lot better. I think that the way that they've built the team around a young quarterback by spending money in free agency is generally a very smart thing to do, as you've seen other teams do with like Carson Wentz and Jared Goff, things like that. So if they do hit on Josh Allen, and he has a great year. I mean, this is what makes it an interesting season for them. If he makes that huge jump like Jared Goff did or like Carson Wentz did, you're talking about being a 10-6, 11-5, especially because the AFC East is not good. I still don't expect the New York Jets to be a great team, and I definitely don't expect the Miami Dolphins to be a great team. I mean, the Dolphins could be like 2-14. So, I think that they're one of the more interesting teams in the league when you're trying to predict, because so much of it rests on whether he makes that year 2 jump.
Awesome. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate you coming on to do a podcast interview with us. Hopefully we can have you back sometime soon. Enjoy the rest of your summer. I appreciate it, man.
Yeah, anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.